Hello, everyone. Today we will discuss Plato and more specifically a famous text of his known as the Allegory of the Cave. I emphasize allegory and not myth of the cave, as it is sometimes referred to. A myth is a foundational story for a civilization, whereas Plato's text does not aim to found a civilization. The Allegory of the Cave is a text that provides a condensed summary of Plato's thought, and that is why I wanted to make this video today, as one cannot truly approach the philosophy of Plato without encountering this text in one way or another. A few biographical reminders. Plato was a Greek philosopher from the 5th and 4th centuries BC, a disciple of Socrates, who wrote nothing and whose teaching was exclusively oral. What we know of Socrates' philosophy comes through the writings of Plato, particularly his dialogues where he stages characters he has encountered, including Socrates himself. In these texts, Plato gives us an insight into Socrates' ideas, thoughts, and conceptions through exchanges with various interlocutors. Gilles Deleuze has suggested that Plato's characters were conceptual characters rather than historical figures, given that it is impossible to verify whether the dialogues transcribed by Plato actually took place. Thus, it is difficult to know whether these texts faithfully reflect Socrates' thoughts, or if they actually express the ideas of Plato himself. But that is a discussion for specialists. Let us simply recall that Plato is a central figure in ancient philosophy, whose influence continues to this day. Plato expresses his thoughts most exhaustively in a work titled The Republic, where he describes in detail the Akkadi polis, the beautiful city. It is in this work that the Allegory of the Cave is found, a crucial part where Plato, in a metaphorical form, sets out his conception of access to knowledge and illustrates what the human condition represents. Before delving into the details of this allegory, it would be useful to lay some groundwork. For those interested, you can refer to my previous video on Plato titled Truth is Not of This World. However, I will summarize some essential notions to facilitate the understanding of the analysis and interpretation we will undertake together of the Allegory of the Cave. It is fundamental to understand that for Plato, the reality in which we operate, that is, the material and physical reality surrounding us, is not the true reality. What does this mean? It may sound strange when put this way, but to understand it, one must grasp a crucial distinction Plato makes in his work between two types of realities, one subordinated to the other, the sensible reality and the intelligible reality. Starting with sensible reality, it is the world in which we operate daily. It is the physical world, perceptible to our senses. It is the material reality subject to change, to evolution, and governed by temporal cycles. The reality you observe around you has not always been as it is. For example, the trees you see did not exist from eternity. In a forest, or even in the face of a mountain rising before you, it has not always been this way. Hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years ago, the tree you are looking at did not exist, nor did the mountain in front of you. All of this is the result of physical evolution, a perpetual transformation of the material world. The sensible world, the material and physical world, is one of continuous transformation, the world of becoming. For Plato, becoming is always synonymous with degradation. Let's take a simple example. If you buy an object, any object, that object will inevitably wear out over time. It will eventually stop functioning, possibly ending up in the trash or being recycled. This object will degrade until it almost completely disappears. Even though the atoms that compose it do not disappear, the object as such will cease to exist because of the degradation of matter over time. This matter does not have a potential for permanence. Similarly, the human body also degrades over time. It ages, wears out, and eventually decomposes until it disappears. Thus, the physical body is an example of the inevitable process of evolution of any material, being that eventually degrades and vanishes over time. Let us keep in mind that the sensible reality, as described by Plato, our physical world, our everyday life, is a world characterized by perpetual transformation and imperfection. Upon reflection, the sensible reality is primarily defined by movement. In our world, everything is in motion, including the atoms in seemingly inert objects. Take a book lying in front of you. Although it appears immobile, the atoms that constitute it are in perpetual motion. This is precisely why a book exists. Immobile atoms would mean dead atoms, and the object itself would not exist. Thus, every physical body is made up of atoms, molecules, and components in motion, which confer a material existence upon them. The physical world is, by definition, the world of movement. This idea aligns with Heraclitus' doctrine of mobilism, which states that everything is mobile, everything is in motion. This notion led Heraclitus to assert that the only constant in our world is its perpetual transformation. Impermanence, the ever-changing and evolving nature, this permanent cosmic dynamism that makes everything that exists materially subject to time and becoming. The physical world is the world of becoming. I have already discussed this example in my video on Bergson and time. If you observe a person for several hours, you will not see them age visually. The signs of aging will not appear on their face to the naked eye. Yet, you know that the aging process is continuous. It never stops. Thus, we all age, and every second that passes brings us closer to death. This reality of incessant becoming characterizes the physical world. Our physical reality is defined by becoming, which ensures that things never remain identical to themselves and that everything that begins eventually comes to an end. If death or time did not exist, that is, if things always remained the same, we probably wouldn't ask ourselves so many questions. This is how the physical world and its incessant mobilism are characterized. However, for Plato, movement certainly defines our world, the sensible world perceivable by our senses. But this world is not the entirety of reality. Beyond our sensible world, Plato envisions the existence of another reality, an invisible reality imperceptible to our senses, yet superior to our sensible reality. He calls this the intelligible reality, also referred to as the world of essences, ideas, or intelligible forms. These terms are synonymous in Plato's philosophy, and he posits that essences have a degree of reality superior to that of the sensible reality. This idea is challenging for us, who often equate reality with materiality. That which is palpable, perceptible, something you can touch or see, is considered real, implying a concrete and physical existence. However, the intelligible reality is a non-material reality superior to the sensible reality, with a higher degree of being than our material reality. This raises the question, what are these essences, these ideas, this intelligible reality that Plato speaks of and which is imperceptible to our senses? Explaining this is complex, and like Plato, I will use an analogy to aid understanding. Imagine a video game. When playing a video game, you are faced with a virtual reality. You control a character who moves through a universe. When you play, you are well aware that this character does not really exist. It is virtual, digital, not a flesh and blood being. But even though the character is digital, it operates within a universe that has its own rules and structures, just like our world has its physical laws. These structures and rules of the video game, though immaterial, structure everything that happens in the game, just as Platonic essences or ideas structure the reality of our sensible world. When you play a video game, the character you control does not really exist. What, then, is the nature of this character? It is not merely a projection of your mind, as anyone can see it on the screen. This character and the universe it moves through are the products of a computer language, a code that creates the illusion of a character and a universe. You do not directly perceive the computer code. You see what it visually generates on the screen. You do not need to understand the code to play the game, as the gaming experience itself is what interests you. However, for the video game to function, it must first be coded. This computer coding is the origin of the game, the foundation upon which the animations you see are built. If we adopted a Platonic perspective, we might say that what is more real than the images on the screen are the lines of computer code that manifest through these animations. If you delete the code, the video game ceases to exist, demonstrating a dependence between the visual animations and the computer code. The true structure of the video game lies in its code, not in the visual animations, which are merely manifestations of this code. If you have understood this analogy, then you have grasped the essence of Platonic metaphysics, which is the distinction between the sensible reality and the intelligible reality. For this video, I have chosen to read a specific text to better illustrate this point. You can follow the transcription of the text on the screen. Note that I have made some cuts and modifications to make the text more accessible. we will discuss the condition of men in an underground cave, chained in such a way that they can only look forward, exposed only to shadows cast on the cave wall by a fire. These shadows are all they have seen their entire lives. If these men were released and cured of their ignorance by forcing them to turn towards the light, they would suffer and be dazzled, unable to see the reality of the objects whose shadows they had previously seen. If asked about what they see, they might not believe that what they are now seeing is more real than the shadows they have always known. Imagine someone telling you that until now, you have only seen shadows, but now, turned towards more real things, you see more clearly. And if you were forced to look directly at the light, wouldn't your eyes be hurt? Wouldn't it damage your vision for seeing what you could before? If you were forced out of your cave and had to climb a steep and rugged ascent, not being released until you reached the sunlight, wouldn't you suffer intensely and complain about this violence? And once you reached the light, with your eyes dazzled by its brilliance, could you distinguish anything of what we now call true? You would need time to adjust to clearly see the objects of the upper world. At first, it would be the shadows that you perceive most easily, then the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. After that, you could more easily contemplate the clarity of the stars and the moon at night than the sun and its light during the day. Eventually, you could see and contemplate the sun as it is. This image must now be meticulously applied to our previous discussions, comparing the world revealed by sight to the prison, and consider the sunlight as the enlightening power. The ascent to the upper region and the contemplation of these objects should be seen as the ascent of the soul towards the intelligible realm. By following this interpretation, you will not misunderstand my intentions. In the intelligible realm, the idea of the good is perceived last and with difficulty, but once perceived, it is clear that it is the cause of everything that is great and beautiful in all things. It generates light and governs the moon in the visible world, and in the intelligible world, it reigns supreme, dispensing truth and intelligence. It is essential to see it to act with wisdom. We will now proceed to a hermeneutic, that is, an interpretation of this text based on our knowledge of Platonic metaphysics. The first thing to interpret is obviously the metaphor of the cave itself. A cave is a dark, underground place. We retain these ideas to understand what they symbolize in the Platonic context. Darkness symbolizes ignorance, while light has always been associated with knowledge and truth. In Plato's symbolism, darkness clearly represents ignorance as opposed to light, which has traditionally been associated with knowledge and truth. This association is even found in everyday language, when we ask someone to shed light on a subject, or when someone is described as a light, highlighting their role in intellectual enlightenment. Thus, darkness is linked to ignorance, and this term refers to obscurantism, which denotes a reluctance to abandon one's ignorance. The cave, being an underground place, evokes ignorance and fits into a hierarchy of elements where the lower is considered the most vile, an idea that echoes the Christian notion of hell, opposed to the celestial paradise. The sky, the realm of the spirit, is seen as superior, and raising one's spirit is often perceived as achieving a moral or intellectual superiority. Thus, situating the action in an underground cave symbolizes the lowest point in the hierarchy of knowledge. In Plato's philosophy, the earth symbolizes physiological needs, the material aspects that tie us to our animal condition. In Plato's ideal society, artisans and farmers, who work the land and with their bodies, occupy the base of the social pyramid. They are essential for meeting vital physiological needs. In contrast, at the top of the pyramid, we find the ruling philosophers, navigating in the celestial domain of ideas and thought, emphasizing the Platonic ideal that the spirit should govern matter. The underground cave is a metaphor for the initial ignorance of humans, a mark of our human condition at birth. This is not a pejorative judgment. It is simply a reminder that we all start at the same level, without prior knowledge, in the earthly sphere, and our quest is that of elevation towards knowledge and the light of the spirit. The notion of reason is approached by Plato as a process requiring work, which is explored in detail in the continuation of the Allegory of the Cave. A crucial aspect to highlight is the condition of the prisoners, chained, which symbolizes their inability to move freely. Being chained here means they are deprived of the ability to move and therefore cannot observe various objects or change their viewpoint. This immobility prevents any diversification in observation, a crucial initial step for knowledge that begins with the ability to compare and relate different observations. Knowledge, according to Plato, requires detaching from the immediate object to explore other perspectives, engaging in comparison and relation between various elements. This underscores the importance of the relationship to plurality. The human mind produces knowledge by extracting generalities from a collection of specific cases, corresponding to the inductive method typical of empiricism. It is by observing and comparing the objects of our experience that we begin to formulate laws and generalities about these objects. For Plato, the initial stage of knowledge, accessible even to the prisoners of the cave, is limited to the knowledge of particular and immediate facts due to their inability to explore beyond. This knowledge is what Plato describes as opinion, or doxa, which can be seen as a superficial or confused understanding derived from isolated experiences without a comparative context. If the prisoners had the ability to move, they could access a higher level of knowledge, that of the general, which broadens the perspective and enriches understanding. The immobility of the prisoners symbolizes their limited access to knowledge, confined to perceiving and interpreting the world only through a restricted and unchanged framework. Without the possibility to discover and compare other perspectives that would enrich their understanding of the world. Plato distinguishes between two levels of opinion, simple opinion and right opinion. Simple opinion arises from an isolated experience, while right opinion is built through repeated experiences and various comparisons. However, it is important to note that both types of opinions concern the knowledge of the material, meaning they relate to physical objects. Plato emphasizes that the material world, or sensible world, does not possess the same degree of reality as the intelligible world. Therefore, knowledge gained about the material world is considered less valuable than that of intelligible realities. In this context, knowledge of the material remains in the realm of opinion, doxa, because the material reality is by nature changeable and corruptible. Thus, it does not allow for the attainment of true knowledge, which would be that of essences or intelligible realities. In Plato, the transition to the knowledge of intelligible realities, what he calls science or episteme, marks the passage from opinion to true knowledge. The allegory also emphasizes that these men have been chained since childhood, symbolizing their deep conditioning. This conditioning implies that they have known no other reality than that of their confined life in the cave. This underscores the importance of perspective and how our initial viewpoints can limit our understanding of the world. True knowledge, according to Plato, involves breaking away from this initial subjectivity, a process he describes as detaching from our limited perspectives. Childhood is described as a critical period when the mind is formed and learning is most effective. Thus, indoctrination or conditioning from childhood is particularly powerful and difficult to challenge in adulthood. The prisoners of the cave, chained since childhood, illustrate how profoundly our understanding can be influenced by our early experiences, and how difficult it can be to transcend these initial impressions to achieve a deeper and more objective understanding of the world. Overcoming their ignorance and accessing a higher level of knowledge is a complex process, exacerbated by alienation, a deeply ingrained inability to consider another way of seeing the world. This radical incapacity to question our beliefs constitutes the very essence of our condition, similar to the prisoners of Plato's cave. As Socrates points out, we are like these prisoners. We have been conditioned from childhood by beliefs, habits, and behaviors that have become second nature to us. This condition makes us nearly incapable of freeing ourselves from our initial ignorance. At the heart of the allegory of the cave, shadows play a crucial role. A shadow is simply the projection of an object, created when light is intercepted. Although a shadow is not an object in itself, it is perceived as such by the prisoners. They confuse these projections with real objects, a logical but profound error. This confusion illustrates how, in reality, we often mistake material objects for the true essence of things, taking what is ephemeral for what is permanent. Shadows, areas of darkness, are metaphors for ignorance. They distort the reality of the object they project, changing size and shape depending on the position of the light and the observer's perspective. This symbolizes how the perception of physical objects can vary and become distorted over time, thus illustrating Plato's idea that the sensible world is merely a series of appearances, distortions of the intelligible reality. The allegory of the cave teaches us that the world we live in, full of shadows and shifting forms, is but a pale imitation of the world of forms, where the true essences reside. These essences or ideas are immutable and eternal, unlike the objects of our sensible world, which are in perpetual change. This understanding is crucial for anyone seeking to attain true knowledge, breaking away from illusion to embrace the truth. The next stage of Plato's allegory involves the liberation of the prisoners, imagining what would happen if they were freed from their chains. Liberating the prisoner from his chains implies an external intervention, an act of liberation, which means that access to knowledge is not a spontaneous or autonomous process. There is no reason to emerge from ignorance if it is not confronted with a contradiction, if it is not challenged by an external element. For the world of illusions, the world of appearances can be very convincing. It is perfectly possible to construct coherent intellectual systems around a fictitious situation. One can establish a logic based on erroneous facts, hence the need for an external intervention. This intervention does not necessarily need to be human. It could be a disruptive element that comes to challenge the established system. This recalls the principle that philosophy is born of wonder. A word that shares etymology with thunder, it is the lightning that strikes our beliefs, challenging what we hold to be true. This principle illustrates the dialectic that one can only gain perspective on oneself through the mediation of others. Sometimes, we need an external viewpoint to take a step back from ourselves. Although we know ourselves well, being constantly with ourselves, we are also the ones who know ourselves the least. This is because habit breeds inattention, as shown by road accidents that often occur on familiar routes. The more accustomed we are to something, the less attention we pay to it. Thus, to challenge our beliefs and advance in our understanding, an external intervention may be necessary to help us take a step back. The other then becomes a mediator between us and knowledge. It is often uncomfortable because the other confronts us with our certainties and, if sincere, exposes us to truths we prefer to avoid. The importance we place on the opinion of a loved one comes from recognizing the value of their viewpoint, which can reveal aspects of ourselves we were not aware of. This disturbance of our certainties can be unpleasant, an idea that Plato illustrates by the dazzlement of the prisoner exposed to sunlight in the allegory of the cave. Dazzlement is a shock, a violence, a burst too intense to be tolerated initially. It is a powerful metaphor for the effects of truth when confronted for the first time. We are dazzled by the truth not because it is luminous in itself, but because our eyes are not accustomed to it. It is not the truth that is dazzling, but our first confrontation with something new that is. Once a truth is accepted and integrated, it loses its harsh aspect. However, initially, the confrontation with the light of truth can be unpleasant. But as Plato points out, our eyes eventually become accustomed to this truth. This requires time. What Plato illustrates here is the progressive nature of accessing the truth. Access to it is not instantaneous. We do not dive directly into the truth. We do not move from ignorance to truth without intermediate phases. The text explains that the former prisoner begins by discerning shadows, then reflections of things in water, thus highlighting a hierarchy of elements, with water being considered superior to earth. Eventually, he manages to perceive objects directly. Plato describes the process of knowledge as an ascent, an elevation of the soul towards the intelligible world. At the end of this process, it becomes possible to directly contemplate objects, to look at them face to face, what Plato calls the contemplation of essences. At this stage, one transcends the realm of opinion, that is, knowledge of the sensible world, to enter the realm of science, or knowledge of intelligible realities. To illustrate this ascent of the soul towards the intelligible world, let's take the example of beauty. Plato teaches us that to access the idea of beauty, that is, beauty as an essence, as an intelligible form, it is necessary to go through several stages. The first involves recognizing beauty in specific things or people, that is, perceiving a particular material object manifesting beauty. This stage corresponds to the perception of a beautiful object or the encounter with an attractive person facing a material and particular manifestation of beauty. The second stage involves generalizing beauty to all things or all people sharing this characteristic. At this point, one reaches a higher level of knowledge, that of general material. However, even at this stage, we remain in the realm of material knowledge. Indeed, we remain in what Plato calls opinion, or doxa. This necessitates accessing a third level of knowledge, the knowledge of beauty itself, that is, beauty as a pure idea, independent of material manifestations. This beauty itself is the beauty that exists outside of concrete manifestations. It does not require the contemplation of objects or people to be recognized. This understanding allows you to perceive beauty in everything and beyond all materiality. This is what Plato describes as the idea of beauty, or beauty in itself, which crowns the process of abstraction, the ascent of the soul towards the spirit, the elevation towards immaterial knowledge. Plato asserts that knowledge is always of the immaterial. Take the example of a circle. Before being a shape perceived by our senses, it is an intelligible reality, an idea, a concept. Similarly, for beauty, you do not need to see or imagine something beautiful to understand what beauty is. It becomes a spiritual reality, an intelligible reality. Knowledge of material things is by nature impermanent because it depends on the transformations of these things. The validity of this knowledge is limited to the time during which the material object remains unchanged. Conversely, essences or intelligible forms are immutable, fixed, escaping any variation. The task of the philosopher is then to recognize these essences in everything that contains beauty. In Plato's philosophy, there exists a supreme essence beyond other essences, the good itself, the idea of the good. In the allegory of the cave, the good is represented by the sun, which is both the source of life through its heat and what makes the world intelligible through its light. The sun is the condition of our existence and our ability to know, thus linking life and consciousness. Living is a gift, and being aware of life is to recognize this gift. This gift carries a responsibility, that of taking care of what we are responsible for. In essence, understanding life and consciousness as a sublime gift is to reach the ultimate understanding of the good, the highest goal a human can aspire to. In Plato's philosophy, the ultimate meaning of life is identified with the good, which is equated with unity. Unity reigns above the world of multitude, suggesting that we all originate from this unity. Upon birth, we are immersed in the multitude, plunged into chaos, separated from this original unity and eternity. However, a part of us maintains a connection with this eternity, our soul. It is our soul that knows the truth, remembers the unity from which it comes, and aspires to return there to complete the cycle of becoming. Thank you.